Let's continue. Let's continue. Thank you for being back in time so we can continue at 12 at noon. We are delayed by half an hour, pretty much exactly half an hour, but I think it's okay because we have a rather generous lunch break. We're expecting to get a little delayed, so we'll have two 25-minute presentations, which means we have our lunch break at 1 and we'll start our afternoon program at 2. I already mentioned a few remarks on the symposium. So this was about Judaism, Jewish life in Landau. We structured the day as follows: Jewish life, then after that wine, the second presentation on wine and wine culture in Palatinate. And this was a theoretical experience, but hopefully a practical one as well, with you enjoying wine downstairs. And then after that came the question, what is the meaning of wine in Judaism? Judaism and wine. If you know the Bible, you know that Noah, after the ark landed, he planted a vineyard. So we were looking for someone that could go into this aspect. We read the book Wine and Judaism, which was published in 2014. You can still buy a copy and read the details. So the author is Andreas Lehnhardt. He is a professor of Judaistic at the University Gutenberg in Mainz. He is a Protestant theologian, and he focuses on these questions. So we're very happy and very thankful that he accepted our invitation to give a presentation. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Lehnhardt. Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind words of introduction, and thank you for your invitation to come to Landau. I have relatives here, and so I like visiting Landau, and I like coming back to Landau. However, this is not an easy time for Jewish topics. We heard about the largest wine region here, and nowadays, rockets are being fired on the largest vineyards in Israel, on Haifa, and the Golan Heights. Very good wines come from that region, and they're being attacked. And I would like to mention that these are special times that we live in. Also, according to the Jewish tradition, that's the 10 days of repentance between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is going to start tomorrow. And therefore, Miss Landi, Shana Tova, Machatima Tova. Happy New Year to you and to your family, and all the best to your family. I would like to present wine and kosher wine. Since biblical times until today, wine has played an important role in Judaism and Christianity. Cults, arts, and economy in Judaism as well as in Christianity have been in many ways dealing with wine and viticulture since ancient times. We already mentioned the spies from the Bible, Numbers. So we all know the biblical stories of the fertility of the land flowing with milk and honey. And we see archaeology and evidence of that. And those spies spying out the land, the promised land, and bringing back grapes to Moses and Aaron. So this is the biblical foundation for the appreciation of wine in Judaism. We already heard about Noah, and the first vineyard and viticulture by Noah, and then Noah getting drunk. And all these stories show that the Bible, as a foundation of Christianity and also of rabbinical Judaism, it was a important foundation for wine and enjoying wine, and also integrating ethical and religious thinking in different ways. The danger and pleasure of drinking wine are already mentioned in many stories in the Bible. And today, this is still a topic, which we shouldn't forget. Lots of churches decided to not use wine in the Eucharist tradition, but rather grape juice. And liberal Jewish communities do that as well. They want to respect alcoholics and not give them wine with alcohol. That's why in the Bible there are stories about abstinence. The Nazarites, mentioned in Numbers, were abstinent, and that includes wine as well. At the same time, the Bible and the rabbi culture, the Talmud, emphasize that there is no joy without wine. So wine is part of Christian and Jewish writings. It is part of the reality, and it is part of the religion as itself. And time and again, it is recommended to have a moderate consumption of wine and not get drunk or be a drunkard. However, there is never a ban of alcohol, as we have later in Islam. Starting with the Ummah reforms in the 7th century, it was the so-called Pact of Umar, which forbids Muslims from drinking alcohol. So using alcohol in Islam is more complicated, but this is an entirely different story. Drunkenness and alcohol have always been banned. Philo of Alexandria mentions, when he speaks about Noah in the narrative in Genesis, he says sobriety is more important than drunkenness. However, Philo, the thinker, and he was alive with Paul of Tarshish, he doesn't have that aspect of kosher wine. And research is not sure whether kosher wine was already a tradition. Only in the rabbinic times, after the destruction of the temple by the Romans, it was developed, and kosher wine was defined, and there was a greater contrast to Christianity. But what is kosher wine actually? Does it taste differently? People always ask that. Does it taste different than Christian wine? And if you do try, there is no difference, let me tell you. Kosher does not mean a special way of preparation in Judaism, but it means suitable, kasher in Hebrew, which is a ritual usability of the wine. And that means it's suitable for certain purposes. For example, for giving the blessing. The wine in itself, when it's made, as I mentioned, Israel produces wine today, and it's not changed, and it's not produced differently, and it doesn't taste any different than non-kosher wine. However, not every kosher wine is suitable for every opportunity or event. There are special kosher wine, for example, a wine for Passover, for the Passover, which is even more strict when it comes to kosher, and it's called kosher le Pesach. You can see that on bottles, actually, because it's Pesach kosher wine. And today, people try to make sure to produce wine in a way that it's already suitable for Pesach and other special occasions. But what does that actually mean? Kosher wine is wine that has not come into contact with non-Jews. It might sound shocking to you. However, it goes back to traditional views. The non-Jewish tradition, starting with the Greeks and then the Romans later on, they had wine for sacrifices or for idol sacrifice. And this wine is called Yain Nesech, pour out offering, sacrifice wine, was used on lots of occasions in the temples, in different ceremonies, and it was sprinkled on altars. And therefore, it was obvious that it was a ritual wine and used ritually, and the Jewish side didn't want to have anything to do with that. And as a consequence, the Talmuds and the ancients decided that wine produced by non-Jews, such as bread and olive oil, are non-kosher. That means non-suitable for consumption or utilization for Jews. There's a different Babylonic Talmud tradition that says no every contact with non-Jewish wine is forbidden. That means you can't drink a glass of wine with your Jewish neighbors at night. And the rabbis in ancient times says that there is a danger of mixed marriages or interreligious marriages. That is very close to reality. However, the background is that from a Jewish side, there was no ban for women to drink wine. However, the Roman culture and the Greek culture did have that. Roman women that drank wine were not seen as reliable. Trade and turnover made by trading with wine was forbidden, such as consuming meat, which was used, possibly used for non-Jewish tradition and sacrifice. This is not only about pigs and pork, but it's rather about the ritual preparation of food, which adheres to specific standards. From a biblical perspective, it's not entirely clear why the ban on drinking wine. In the medieval times, Moses ben Maimer, who died in 1204, tried to interpret verses, Deuteronomy 7, verse 26, and tries to interpret it in a way that there is a prohibition of non-Jewish wine, and that's how he argues. However, that verse only says, don't bring abomination into your house, and abomination is interpreted as non-Jewish wine. Moses Nachmanides, a little later, tried to explain that ban, that it's only about using wine and not drinking that wine. So a biblical reasoning could not be found. No scholar could find a biblical proof. It's rather a rabbinic tradition or rabbinic decision. They took the law and said, we don't want non-Jewish wine, so we don't have mixed marriages and don't water down, so to speak, our culture, our group. And that also posed restrictions for Jewish wine culture. And it took up to Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Ritzrak in Worms, who simplified the rules. And basically, the entire story of Jewish wine merchant is based on that decision. Without that decision, we would still not have Jewish wine trade that non-Jews could also enjoy. Because Rashi in Ashkenaz, Germany, France, was born into a wine trading family. He came from the area of Champagne, we already heard about that, and he moved to the Rhineland, and he perceived that there are good wines in this region and that trade is very profitable for Jews as well. So therefore, he decides a response, a halaic answer, that non-Jewish wine, just wine, in Hebrew danyanyam, that means wine of non-Jews could be used for special purposes. And therefore, it's also allowed to trade that wine. And that lifts the ban that had been imposed for centuries. And here in our Shum cities, it marks the breakthrough for Judaism and Jewish families to trade with non-Jewish wine and the other way around, which is another simplification thanks to Rashi, for non-Jews to be allowed to transport Jewish wine or even to store Jewish wine, which up to then was forbidden. Up to the 11th century, it was forbidden or avoided. And another important rabbi from Mainz, my hometown, Rabbi Gershom, Light of Diaspora, prohibits this. So in the earlier generation, they couldn't even think about doing that. However, we hear from Christian sources around 1090, the Emperor Henry allowed people or Jews to sell Jewish wine to Christians. So this is non-Jewish evidence that things started to change. In the 12th century, export of kosher wine from Germany to England is also documented. There are documents in France where cultivation of Jewish wine was only in smaller vineyards, which were only built to serve private consumption. In Mainz, on the Kastrich in the 11th century, they had their own little private vineyards. They didn't produce to a large amount, and they might not have exported anything. But from the 13th century on, we have no more documents, no more documentation, and there's no real explanation. There might be climate change involved or stricter Christian legislation, and it might have been forbidden for Jews to have their own vineyards and cultivate their own wine. However, until the 16th century, there are still numerous rabbinical replies, so-called responsa, that talk about dealing and trading with non-Jewish wine. However, it did not take long for another ban, because in Joseph's Caro's famous Shulchan Aruch, the table, the main document, intensified the restrictions on wine again. However, after that was a different reaction. Alan Moshe Isserles, famous commentator of Shulchan Aruch, recalled in his famous glosses, the Mappa, mentioned Rashi again. In other words, non-Jewish wine was not necessarily sacrifice wine. And that it was another important decision because it laid down that Christians are not idolaters, which is a great advantage, and as a consequence, their wine does not only serve idolatry and sacrifices, and not only used for altars and sprinkling altars. Rashi accepted Eucharist wine and didn't interpret it as idol wine anymore. All that had consequences for handling wine, and wine is important for lots of Jewish traditions, for example, at the Shabbat, Kiddush, and special occasions such as funerals or even celebrations. You might have heard of weddings and wedding ceremonies where at the end you crush the glass and you commemorate the destruction of the temple, and lots of other examples. Wine is part of the Jewish traditions, and it has practical implications as well. And the rabbis supported this development. So there is a way of rabbi practicism regarding wine, which has been criticized throughout the centuries, of course, back and forth. But however, it opened doors to get in touch with the non-Jewish environment and trade wine with the non-Jewish community. From the 17th century onwards, there is evidence for Italy that Jews even used non-Jewish wine for Kiddush and Hadvadatvala for ritual purposes. So non-Jewish wine for ritual purposes, which was unthinkable before that. But in such a country like Italy, wine is all around. And that's why it was only logical for them to also use non-Jewish wine. There were other regions and other countries in the world where it was sometimes impossible to grow and cultivate wine, and so the Jewish traditions looked for alternatives. The Babylonian Talmud mentions using beer produced by Christians for Haftalah, for example. For travelers that couldn't transport kosher wine bottles, raisin wine was a possible alternative to wines. Sorry, if you're well acquainted with viticulture, then sorry, bear with me. But Eastern European Judaism, and even in the United States, I've seen that. Polish traditions, they drink raisin wine for Shabbat, even though it'd be easy for them to get kosher wine in the United States. But it is a family tradition, especially when it comes to Eastern European traditions and Eastern European Judaism. The Orthodox Judaism, only they discussed and argued about the blessings. This is a blessing, a table blessing that includes a wine blessing as well. There are different wordings that hint at what is being drunken. More priagafen is a blessing over the grape, the vine. And if you say that blessing, you have wine in your glass. But lots of other people use Shehakol, different blessing over everything created. And if you are invited for a Shabbat, if you hear the blessing, you know what's in the glass. You can already tell what tradition it is. And it gave an opportunity to treat wine or to store wine in different ways. I already mentioned it because storage of wine until today is a problem, especially for Orthodox Jews, because a bottle of wine, or actually a barrel, cannot be unsupervised and left with a non-Jew. Ultra-Orthodox Jews even assume that even a glance or even looking at a wine bottle by a non-Jew results in the fact that the bottle is no longer non-kosher, kosher, very strict. But they think that. So storage of wine had always been an interesting factor. We hear Maharil Mainz died 1400 something in Mainz. He said that if a non-Jew opened a bottle of wine, he could really infuriate a Jew. As long as a non-Jew did not drink the wine could still be kosher. So we see the arguments going back and forth and finding reasons and finding ways to simplify, to not waste wine, to not have to turn it into vinegar, but that would have been non-kosher vinegar that you can only use for cleaning, but not everywhere in the house if it's been touched by a non-Jew, and so on and so forth. But Maharil made that decision, and he said that there is an instance in Vienna where a non-Jew touched a barrel to humiliate a Jew. And the rabbis declared the barrel as kosher because it was an intention act to humiliate and not to render that wine kosher or non-kosher. Maharil therefore says that Mainz, when he was still in Mainz, we will do the same. If, for example, wine barrels are transported on a ship and they're being confused with Christian wine or non-Jewish wine. Sometimes they were kosher wines and non-kosher wines on the ship. And what if they were accidentally mixed or blended or whatever? You imagine all the details. And he just made a pragmatic decision. It's just wine being available for rituals, for life, and not to make life difficult. What made it even easier was that other rabbis, Maharam from Rottenburg, had an important response. He is buried in Worms, in the city of Worms, and he references a similar case in which a Jew in Mainz forgot to lock his wine cellar before the Shabbat. And if he opens the wine cellar on Shabbat, he finds a cup of wine that was used by a non-Jew. And he didn't know what to do. So his barrel was not touched, and his barrel looked untouched. And the rabbi from Speyer thus decided that this barrel would still be kosher because the details could not be determined. And so the other rabbis supported that decision. So you see, the solution is clear. Somebody must have drunk some wine there, but we don't exactly know the details, so we can't decide. So the wine just remains kosher. So you see, it was about the intentions. I have the text here anyways. So a ban was only on wines that were in doubt, like the Samaritan wine, for example, or Arab wine, or produced by Arabs before Islam. They were not reliable. But fresh wine available for Chaim up until today, you can make sure that you circumvent that problem of non-Jews touching the wine. You just use heated up wine, yain merushal, sometimes even mulled wine or called mulled wine. But what it actually means is just a wine that's been heated up until 90 degrees. In Talmud Yerushalayim, it says more. It has to boil, actually. And then you heat it up and you let it cool down. And then this wine is deemed kosher. It's a great decision. It's still pure. You can bless that wine, Porē priagaphem, created from the plant. And it's not idolatry wine anymore, because you know that idolaters will never use a wine that's been heated up for their sacrifices. So that's a practical decision that we see in the Rhineland all throughout. And so it was just it was possible that way to have non-Jews pour the wine for you. You open a bottle and pour wine for a Jew is impossible. I myself experienced that. I poured some wine for a Jewish guest. It was kosher wine, but he said, "No, don't do it. You're not allowed to do it. The Jew needs to open the wine bottle, or it needs to be yain merushal, heated up wine, hot wine." And some rabbis in the Talmud said that it's still good wine. And maybe they were thinking about mulled wine, which has spices in it or not. So that's another important solution that was invented, and that's still the tradition up until today. You see that in restaurants in Israel, you see that in restaurants in Germany, you see that in lots of Jewish communities. Not fresh wine being poured or normal wine being poured, but rather that heated up wine just to make sure, just to be on the safe side to make sure that wine is kosher. And it's halashish wine. That's a very practical solution. And in former times, you weren't really sure about the chemical facts. You know something about curse and blessing of wine, but people didn't know exactly what was going to happen with the alcohol when it's heated up and so on. Later on, people found out that it's being pasteurized, right? And heated up. And so today it's done in big barrels, in huge barrels, sometimes when it's filled into the bottle or poured into the bottle. And lots of bottles have that label on it saying it's heated wine. If you are familiar with wine, you'll be able to taste it right away. That's not the kosher aspect that you can taste, but rather the heating of the wine that destroys enzymes and everything in the wine, and therefore just changes its characteristics. I'm running out of time. I'll just jump this and leave this out. This is such a bottle. Produced in Germany, kosher for Pasach. Other wines have biological procedures or alcohol content. This bottle warns that consuming alcohol is dangerous, for example. And let me come back to the very beginning of my presentation. Consuming wine in Judaism serves the purpose of life, but if you endanger life, too much alcohol is strictly avoided. But taste is important too. You can find a story in my book where there is a Jewish wine tasting that took place in Worms in the 16th century. So they had different vines and different types, and they imported wines from different areas, and they compared them. So there's a Jewish wine tasting. You can read up that story in my book. But they always made sure that it was halal, or that the procedure was clean. This is a kosher vat, and it has a label and says "Don't touch" for non-Jews. It's written there for non-Jews, "Don't touch," in Hebrew, and it shows that it's very practical when dealing with wine. It's not a dogmatic, doctrinal approach. Let me summarize. I wanted to give you an overview of the development on how to deal with kosher wine, but I also want to point out that kosher wine is not different from normal wine. It's rather a Jewish convention to distinguish Jewish wine from non-Jewish wine, just like wedding and kiddush in the synagogue, where the inner identity is prioritized. However, wine was also used for other purposes. It was also an important means of trade, for example, and we'll hear that in other presentations today. So I presented you rabbinical traditions and decisions and the development throughout the centuries, and then the reformed liberalization of Judaism, where those bans, those kosher wine bans, were not that important anymore, and gave rise to modern day dealing with wine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation, interesting introduction into the connection between Judaism and wine. And I don't know whether I already mentioned it. We've got 2 more presentations this afternoon. And then from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m., we have a panel discussion with all the speakers. And if you got questions, feel free to ask during our panel discussion. So what came to my mind during this presentation, because the Lord Mayor said that this shouldn't be a unique event or an event that only takes place one time, maybe we can even learn something. Well, I think our society really is interested in that we can't deal with ambiguities. And if I hear the decision of the rabbis, I think that we could need more of that knowledge of the rabbis when we make decisions. So this could really help us. Rabbi wisdom, so to speak. This is something that could really be very helpful for us in making decisions. But coming back to our symposium today. After having heard a lot about the culture, the next question is about the economic importance of wine trading, especially at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And I think we've got a very skilled speaker here today, a very experienced speaker, Dr. Engelen. She's going to tell us more about that. She published numerous works on economy and wine trading with a focus on Rheinhessen. She worked at the Institute for National History, which is an institute of the University of Mainz. And she deals with that topic specifically. So she had numerous publications on that topic, and she took a closer look on wine trading in the Palatinate. And I'm looking forward to her presentation. And I'm sure you do too. So very warm welcome, Dr. Engelen. Thank you very much, Herr Scholten, for the kind words of introduction. I feel a bit uncomfortable standing up here because you introduced me as a wine expert, which I'm actually not. I'm an economic and social historian, and so far I haven't had much experience in the field of wine, but I hope I can give you a different perspective today. I think this is closely linked to Ms. Huber's presentation before. I want to deal with the question of the importance of wine trading for the Palatinate economy around 1900. And of course, wine trading was influenced by wine growing in the region itself because it's its basis. And I'm going to tell you more about the development of the wine growing region of the Palatinate, but more from a statistical point of view. So this adds up to Ms. Huber's presentation. So from 1860 until the end of the Second World War, the Palatinate, which at that time also included the later Saar region, belonged to Bavaria. We already heard that, and the so-called Rhine district, which was called Rhine District in 1816, had more than 400,000 inhabitants, and it covered an area of almost 6,000 square kilometers. The population had risen to 937,000 inhabitants, and this meant that the Bavarian Palatinate had around twice as many inhabitants as Rheinhessen, with an area which was more than 4 times as large. So Rheinhessen, to compare it, because it's always that wine-growing region that Palatinate is being compared with, so structurally pretty much the same dimensions. The affiliation to France from 1798 to 1816 led to an early expropriation of the nobility and clergy in the Palatinate on the left bank of the Rhine. And freedom of trade was also introduced during the French period. Both encouraged farmers to harvest larger quantities and to improve the quality of their crops. However, the increase in population in the 19th century combined with the division of property, where the inheritance was divided among all children, in contrast to regions where the first son inherited everything, led to a fragmentation of the land. So you could not make a living from the land that you earned. So part of population emigrated, and this is true for both regions, Palatinate and Rhine-Hessen. And during this period, most people lived from agriculture, and they were often craftsmen, and they worked as craftsmen too to make a living. So, with the industry gradually gaining in importance from 1830 to 1882, the proportion of the Palatinate population working in agriculture fell from 69 to 54%. So, it's still more than half of the population. In addition to the cultivation of cereals, such as barley and oats, vegetable cultivation, such as turnips, potatoes, and beans, but also the cultivation of dyes played an important role in the region. And of course, today's subject, the wine, was very important too. So, apart from the Rhine district, only in Lower Franconia and Bavaria there was significant viticulture. However, the Franconian wine growing region, which at the beginning of the 19th century was similar in size to the Rhineland-Palatinate region, shrunk to just under 2,500 hectares. So it decreased in significance compared with the Palatinate. So Johann Philipp Bronner, who traveled many of the wine-growing regions, stated that the Palatinate region had 33,000 acres. Others speak of 30,000 acres, so it's difficult to tell which figure was right. But they also pointed out that it was difficult to sell wine at all because after the Vienna Congress, after 1816, Germany was fragmented in those small states, and between between the Palatinate and Bavaria, there was also a tariff border, so it was very difficult to sell the wine. So there was a low point in wine growing culture, and the wine growing culture only focused on 9,000 hectares. But years later, they talked about 10,000 hectares again. So I don't know. We don't really understand how they came up with those figures and which of the figures were correct in the end, because a vineyard doesn't grow overnight. We don't know whether this wave development really happened or whether the figures were just not correct. That's always difficult with early statistics. So viticulture was concentrated in the foothills of the Hart Mountain around Neustadt an der Hart, where quality viticulture was greatly expanded. In the areas south of Neustadt, with Landau in the center, viticulture intensified somewhat later, but the wine could not achieve the same prices. In the Rhine plain, to the east of the Hart, viticulture stagnated in the 19th and 20th century, while in other areas, such as in the northern and western Palatinate, it lost much of its importance. And within Bavaria, Palatinate amounted to 2/3 of the vineyard. So it was that wine-growing region within Bavaria. But the Bavarians were not interested in wine that much. They preferred beer. To put it in figures again, so the area by the mid of the 19th century, from 1853, included 10,000 hectares and increased to 12,000 hectares until 1878. So that is a pretty steep increase. Around the turn of the century. Around the turn of the century, we had 14,500 hectares, and in 1936, in Nazi time, we had 6,600 hectares. So a steep increase during that period. And compared to other wine-growing regions, many of them lost areas, for example, Baden, the Baden region nearby. At the end of the Second World War, we were at a low in wine growing. Due to the war, of course, we lost some workers, or many workers, and many of the works in the vineyards could not be handled anymore. And so pests were a huge problem, and Yeah, by the mid of this second half of the 20th century, it increased again to 23,000 hectares, so it doubled compared to the 19th century. The expansion of the vineyards was certainly a consequence of the fact that Palatinate wine achieved increasingly higher prices with early implementation of quality viticulture, particularly by Ludwig Andreas Jordan from Deidesheim. So around 1820 already, the Mittelharter quality wine has established, and this explains the big price differences in the Palatinate. The cheapest wine from 1822 in Kierweiler cost an average of 70 guilders, and the price from Forst, which was already mentioned before, for Traminer from Deidesheim or from the Rupertsberg, reached 450 guilders per fodder. So a huge difference, as you can see. In the second half of this 19th century, quality Palatinate wine growing was often associated with three large wineries, Bassermann Jordan, Buhl, and Berking Wolf, although other vineyards are also mentioned. And in the 20th century, harvests or yields fluctuated greatly. In the 1870s, for example, there were very poor wine harvests. In 1871, they only harvested 83,000 hectoliters. The year before, it was 250,000 hectoliters. But those years were very poor. Compared to 1899, the yield was at 740,000 hectoliters. So that was 3 times that of that poor year and almost 10 times of that very poor year. So, but in some years we had less yield, but this doesn't mean that for example, one year the yield was only half, but the financial yield was almost the same because the wine prices were higher in these years. So it doesn't necessarily have to be bad for the vintners. So the whole yield in Bavaria, almost all of the yield in Bavaria and made in wine came from the Palatinate. For example, in 1894 it was 3/4, and also compared to the other wine-growing regions all over Germany, the Palatinate played an important role because 1/4 of the wine produced in Germany came from the Palatinate. And so the Palatinate was the biggest wine-growing region in the 20s and 30s. Okay, I think I can skip that part. In the second part of the 20th century, technical progress took place. And so the companies had to think whether they want to invest and enlarge their company. So many of them joined forces. Others gave up their company. So the wine growing focused on fewer companies, but bigger companies, and the yields increased per hectare at that time. So quantities changed in the 70s and 60s. And with the glycol scandal that we already heard about, many regions put more focus on quality wines, but the yields are different than we saw them in the 19th century, for example. And for the Rhineland-Palatinate, Palatinate plays an important role financially. As far as wine growing is concerned, in 2017, 1/3 of the agricultural production was due to wine. So it's difficult to put it in figures, put it in numbers, but it has a very, very high significance here. Why do we need wine? Wine trade. Many small businesses could only sell their wine through wine trade and often as bulk wines, but around the turn of the millennium, only 14% of the Palatinate wine growers marketed their wine exclusively in bottles. During the French period, the Palatinate opened up, and we had a large sales markets of France, and the wine trade was established in Palatinate. One difficulty at the time was that the wine was often bought up by traders from outside and was blended with other wines from other regions. And so the Rheinpfalz label Rhine-Palatinate label was missing, so you actually didn't know where the wine came from at that time. But the Rhine-Palatinate label was not that present at that time, and that changed in the 19th century with the quality wine growing. And so it became more interesting to sell wine in bottles back then. We already heard a lot about the wine acts, wine laws in Germany. that protected the brands and the geographical heritage. As viticulture expanded in the Palatinate, so wine trade also increased and became more important, as it was neither possible to drink the wine locally, nor was it possible the quality wine, nor were the quality wines affordable for the Palatinate residents. Until 1830, we had custom territories, but with the German Confederation, with the foundation of the German Confederation, wine trade became more expensive, and so the situation improved with the German Customs Union, with the foundation of the Customs Union, and the trade increased back then. So the tariff barriers were reduced. There were low tariffs temporarily, but the situation had largely improved, and this could be seen by the fact that the number of wine shops increased significantly back then. So what was the advantage of the Rhine-Palatinate region? So there was a huge area, as I already mentioned. In size, the traffic connection was very good, so we have a very good rail network here. I don't know if it's good to see here on the slide. You see the lines are the railway lines, and they were already set up, or the railway network was set up pretty early, but Landau and Neustadt, for example, had a very, very favorable location back then. So turnover increased. It's difficult to put in numbers, but in the 1860s, the wine trade amounted to around 12 million guilders, and 50 years later, 3 times as much. The number of wine merchants in the German customs territory doubled between 1872 and 1892. So a large part of them was located in Bavaria. So all the wine produced in Bavaria was actually produced in the Palatinate. So wine auctions were also very popular in April and May back then, and this was an important institution to sell the wine. For example, here in the Hotel Schwan in Landau, auctions like that took place. The magazine Weinmarkt pointed out in 1883 that wine trade was brisk here. Quote, recently French companies have been buying up quite a lot of small wine shops in our area, and regardless of this, the wine business is generally quite lively. At the beginning of the 21st century, wine trade, including supermarkets, still sell around half of the wine produced here in this area, and cooperatives also play an important role. They sell around 1/5 of the Palatinate wine. In contrast to that, however, self-marketing has become much more important, and it amounts to 1/3. This is again the map of the German trade union. But most of you might already be familiar with that topic. About the importance of Landau for wine trading, many of the regions and places claimed to have been the centers of wine trading, or this is attributed to them. Kerman, for example, describes the mid-19th century as a wine trade center. Deidesheim, where with the large Bassermann-Jordan and Buhl wineries were located, and was the center of the wine trade in the 19th century. For years later, Neustadt an der Hart and also Landau have been mentioned too. So about the history of Landau, we've already heard a lot about that before by my colleagues, and also about the Jewish history. The interesting thing about Landau is that it belonged to France for some time, whereas other regions of Germany haven't. So Landau belonged to France from the 18th century on, so it has a very close connection to France. And the trade with France was always a very vivid one. 1855, Landau was connected to the Palatinate Maximilian Railway between Neustadt an der Hart and Wissembourg and Alsace. And in the 1870s, also in east-west direction from Germersheim to Zweibrücken, with the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871, Landau was no longer border town, but gateway to the new territory. So this also contributed to the fact that the good French-speaking people of Landau came into play as traders. And Landau was back then a very small town with only 6,000 inhabitants, not including the soldiers. But with the abolition of the fortress, Landau could grow, and lots were very cheap. properties were very affordable. So the town had a quite huge Jewish population. Many of them moved to Landau from the surrounding areas. They came from the small villages in the surroundings from 25 kilometers away to Landau. They moved here. And it was often merchants selling goods and things, and wine becomes their most important good over the time. So there are companies that set up somewhere else, but they continue their business when the people moved to Landau. So Landau was the center of wine trading for some decades at least. This is what Johann Georg Lehmann described in mid of the 19th century. He said 2 annual markets, a weekly fruit market, but also the heavily frequented, almost daily, weekly markets are an inexhaustible source of food. They maintain a very lively trade, which is further promoted and increased by the wine trade, fruit, and also by the factories and vinegar, tobacco, and also breweries. So wine trade is mentioned here, but it doesn't play an eminent role in the town's economy, obviously. In 1831, there were 7 wine wholesalers and 1 wine retailer in Landau. At least. Well, even almost 40 years later, the situation had not changed. The Bavarian Trade Directory characterized the economy in 1870 with the keywords gaslighting, viticulture, and wine trade. Furthermore, they mentioned 8 wine merchants, and one of them traded in bulk. In contrast to that, Neustadt had 17 wine merchants and 2 commissions back then, significantly more than 7 years ago. And also here, wine is an important trade good. Deidesheim with 9 merchants, Dürkheim with 9 merchants, and Deidesheim with 12 and Dürkheim with 9 merchants also were important centers. In 1877, the situation changes. The address book of wine merchants listed 41 merchants and commissioners, and in 1900 it was already 71, so still very small. Quite impressive figure, but it shows clearly that within a short period of time, we saw a steep increase. Many companies formed, which were run by 1 or 2 persons, and it's very, very difficult to find out detailed information about those companies, about those merchants. So time before the First World War was the time where the wine trading was most alive or most vivid here in the region. So even at that time, the role of Landau was far from being exclusive. But after that, it became even more difficult to find information about Landau because other cities are mentioned more often. What's interesting about Landau is that the wine trade was managed by many Jewish families. So I think 2/3 of the wine trade companies were managed by Jewish families. So this did not only changed with the rise of the National Socialists, of course, and many of those wine companies or Jewish wine merchants moved to other cities. So the wine trade still has an important meaning, but with World War I and the Great Depression, of course, this changed. For example, Felix Meyer mentions in 1927 in Rhein-Mosel-Pfalz, including the wine regions of Arna, Saar, Ruhr, and Rheinhessen, a propaganda document for the entire wine growing industry did not even mention at all Landau. One reason could maybe be that Meyer was an early National Socialist and he did not acknowledge the importance of Jewish wine trade, maybe. This is one of the reasons why he did not mention Landau. At the same time, during the rise of National Socialists, due to the Aryanization of Jewish companies, wine trade lost its significance. Jewish wine trade lost its significance. So during the National Socialist era, they just... Jewish businesses were just forcibly taken over by non-Jews, and this is what happened back then. Most of the Jewish wine merchants left Landau at the end of 1983, the latest, and amongst the Landau residents whose properties were Aryanized. For example, there were the Rudolf und Maria Bach, Emil Josef, Richard Josef, Leo und Bertha Klein, Emil and Isabella May, Julius and Johanna Leonie Meyer, Jakob and Barbara Meyer, and Robert and Veronika Metzger. And from 1939, Jews were prohibited from independently running a commercial or craft business, although in many cases the economic takeover of the business had already taken before. But some of the Jewish businesses in Landau were subsequently closed down, resulting in a significant decline of the local wine trade. All right. I also got some more information about the other cities in the Palatinate, but I do not want to bother you with that. I think you understood what I wanted to say. Landau played an important role in the Palatinate wine trade, but was not the only city that was important back then. If you compare it with other regions, for example, Mainz and Rheinhessen, it's a different relation because Mainz plays a very important role within the Rheinhessen region, and Landau is only one amongst many cities, or has been one amongst many cities in the Palatinate. What's important is the share of Jewish merchants, which wasn't that high in other cities. So many of the Jews moved to Landau because they found attractive conditions there. The properties were quite cheap, and also the railway connection was very good. What is the role of wine trade for the Bavarian economy? Sorry, I can't find the right slide. So it's difficult to say based on the Bavarian statistics because wine trade is a topic that Bavarians are not very much interested in. So you find breweries everywhere, but wine trading statistics are not en vogue in Bavaria. And if you find some, then all the areas are listed, but not the Palatinate in particular. And the Bavarians are obviously not interested in the Palatinate wine growing. But I was able to find some figures for you around the turn of the centuries. In 1899, 122,000 tons of wine were shipped and only 34,000 were received. So the Palatinate exported more wine than it imported, and the Bavarian State Railroad shipped only 10,000 tons of wine. So only a small share, and received 31,000 tons. So not that many wine drinkers, obviously, in Bavaria back then. And trade played an important role in Bavaria and the Palatinate, but the figures on the people working in the trade segment are not split by regions normally, so you know how many people worked in the trade segment in the Bavaria, but not in Palatinate. And if you want to find it out whether why the trade associations, they don't list wine separately. So you find something like specialties or colonial goods or other categories such as food. And this, of course, includes other food and drinks. And so you don't learn anything about the share of wine. But what should be clear is that especially in the regions or towns where a lot of wine is grown, so everywhere around the hard mountains, for example, wine was the most important industry, and wine trading was of eminent importance. And without wine trading, those villages would not have earned anything. So the wine growing was very important for many of the regions in the Palatinate, to put it in a nutshell. In conclusion, it can be said that wine trade was more important for the Palatinate than can be statistically proven because of the fact that it belonged to Bavaria for a long time, and wine consumption is not that important as beer consumption is, for example, for Bavaria. So thank you very much.
So that's a result of cutting red tape. If you don't do statistics, a century later, you have no more sources to see what has been and how it was. Thank you for your presentation. We'll start our lunch break, and we'll meet again in 1 hour. We'll have a 1-hour lunch break, and then we'll talk about Landau again. And after that, areization. And then the second hour is questions and answers for the presenters. When you came in to register, we have a small piece of paper listing all the restaurants and the little cafes. They do know that we have guests and that they need lunch fast. So I hope you'll be served fast. Enjoy your lunch.